So at Envision, we have relationships between users and enterprise companies. And those relationships are in part represented as membership records that include started at and ended at dates. Using these records, we can see who is an active user at a company at a particular point in time, but it's not really easy within the user interface for people to get a sense of how the enterprise or the organization evolves over time. So I had this thought that I could take all these membership records, and this is just sample data here, and lay it out using a sort of a flow chart or a Gantt chart that would show how a particular user's relationship to a member changes over time and how the members relate to each other based on these relative started at and ended at dates. And these are just UTC milliseconds here. So let's jump over into the browser. And what you'll see is I'm taking all that sample data and I'm laying it out in these horizontal tracks where each track represents a user, and then each gray bar represents a unique membership between that user and this particular enterprise context. And so some of these will end and some of them will start again later on because a user can leave a company and come back to a company. But what we're going to see is that as I scroll horizontally, this user information is actually going to be pinned to the left side of the screen while there's enough room within a given track. So as I start to scroll left, you'll see the user information there is pinned. It starts to drop away when we run out of room within a particular track. And what we're doing here is we're maximizing the amount of information that we can have on the screen at any particular time, even though these elements overlap at different periods. And if we jump into the DOM Explorer, what we can see is that, again, we have a bunch of individual tracks, one track per user, and then within a track we have n number of segments, again because a user can join, leave, and then rejoin a company over time, but no segment should be overlapping. You can't have multiple memberships at the same time to the same company. Now if we dig in, we'll see that we have a segment, and then inside that segment we have this user chip. Now if we look at the user, what you'll see is it has position sticky, and what that's going to do is tell the browser to keep this element pinned to the viewport within the context of its parent element. And by then using left of 0 pixels, we're telling the browser to keep this sticky element pinned to the left side of the viewport, and the 0 just tells us to what kind of offset it should be using. So we can actually go in and adjust this if we wanted to. And you can see that increasing it, it just keeps it pinned farther away from that particular edge, but the left side here is kind of nice. And so what we can see here with the map, and although this map isn't really part of the demo, I think it helps illustrate the relationship between the information. We can come down here and we can see that a particular user, this Leonard Fletcher, joined an enterprise, then left for some number of months between April and December, and then rejoined. In this case, the pink just indicates that the user is still a currently active member. And yeah, I think using the position sticky in a horizontal workflow actually works really nice in this kind of a context. I've never used it in a horizontal scrolling. I've only ever used it to create something like a sticky header in the vertical view, but I think this actually creates kind of a nice experience. I think there's a lot more you could do to this particular demo to make it more intuitive, more information intuitive. But overall, I really enjoyed using the position sticky. And let's just take a quick look at the code to see how it works. So again, I have the sample data. I then pull this sample data into my app component. And what I'm going to do is take these users and these memberships, and I'm going to translate them into these timelines, into a timeline, a set of tracks, and then each track has a set of segments. And the memberships are defined in UTC milliseconds, but my screen is defined in pixels. So what I have to do is take things like this duration in milliseconds, and I have to translate it into a screen resolution for pixels here. I also have one for percentages, and that's just because this little screen map here, this is done in terms of percentages as well, not pixels. That way, as I zoom in and out, I don't have to worry about this thing changing. And you can see all that does, everything here keeps working. So let's just take a quick look at how the translations happen. So I have my users and I'm compiling my user data, and all that's doing is looping over that membership data and collapsing it down into a single user with memberships. So the membership data itself, we might have multiple membership records for a given user, and all I'm doing now is collapsing that down into a single user with memberships. And then if we jump back up to the top, once I have my user data, I'm then setting the timeline, and the timeline now loops over those members and starts mapping them into tracks and then segments within a track. And what you can see is that I'm taking the duration in milliseconds and the offset, meaning the started at, from the window of the entire timeline, and I'm scaling that into milliseconds. And that's really just taking a multiplier. So I'm taking some number of milliseconds and I'm multiplying it to get the number of pixels on the screen. And that way I can zoom in and zoom out, and I'm essentially changing the mapping between pixels and percentages. But anyway, let's now look at the HTML. You can look at the more complex stuff on your own. We have our timeline. We're using a simple ngFor for the tracks. Remember, each track is an individual user. Then we're using an ngFor to get the segments out of each track, and we're going to map those using the left and the width percentages. And again, we just have our user. The user here, if we look at the CSS now, our segment, again, represents a membership in time between a user and an enterprise. And all we're doing is having that user be position sticky with a left of 0. And that's what gets this user element here to stick to the left side of the viewport while we scroll across this particular segment. So again, just a fun exploration. I've never used position sticky in a horizontally scrolling context before. And overall, I feel like this actually creates a fairly nice user experience. Again, maximizing the amount of information we have in the viewport at a particular given moment in time, allowing the user to get a better understanding of how all the data relates to each other.